Good day once again. Welcome to our course Taxation 231, which is income taxation, and we're now in Chapter 2. I'm your host, your professor, and your instructor moderator, Attorney Lyndon A. Maceren. So income taxation part 2 is about tax administration. So we discuss additional principles on tax and tax administration. So first, there is a prospective application of tax laws. So meaning a tax bill or a law can only be applied and operative after its effectivity. So when its effectivity date is January 1 in 2018, so it cannot be applied before that date. So it should be prospective. So after its approval, the law only applies to present and future transactions. So if the law is to be applied retroactively or before that date of effectivity, then there should be a clear intent on the part of the legislature to impose the law before the effectivity date. So there's another principle, which is imprescriptibility of taxes, meaning the taxes in general are not cancelable. So it does not expire. Although prescriptive period are provided in the tax code, the prescriptive will only be applicable to those taxes which were returnable or refundable. The prescriptive period shall start from the time the taxpayer files his tax return and declares his tax liability. Then we have double taxation. This means that a state or the same taxing authority, like the Philippines, is taxing twice for the same purpose in the same year or period upon the same property or activity of the same person, when it should be taxed only one time. However, there is no constitutional prohibition on double taxation. Hence, it is not a valid defense against the validity of tax measure. So if the tax law is valid, double taxation cannot be a defense. Double taxation can only be a valid defense if the law is oppressive and inequitable, or there is inequality in the implementation of the tax. So there are two kinds of double taxation, which is the direct double taxation. In a strict sense, this is prohibited because it comprises imposition of the same tax on the same property for the same purpose by the same state or government during the same year. So there are all the same tax, same property, same purpose, same state or government, and same year or taxing period. So, but there is no double taxation in the following cases: by taxing corporate income, meaning the corporation is taxed on its income, and stockholders of the corporation, of the same corporation, are taxed on its dividends. So the dividends is the profit of the corporation and divided among the stockholders. Is there double taxation in that case? The answer is no. Another, a tax imposed by the state and the LGU upon the same occupation, calling, or activity. So if the state, which is the national government, if the national government would tax a lawyer, and at the same time the LGU, which is the local government, if Cebu City will tax the same profession, there is no double taxation because there is no direct double taxation, because it is imposed by different government, different state or different authority. And number 3, real estate tax and income tax collected on the same real estate property, which is leased for income purposes. So the rent income of the property is taxed for its rent or income as an income tax that is taxed by the national government, while real estate tax is taxed by the local government. This is tax on the property, whether it's used or not used. So if you buy a real property, then you will start paying real property taxes to the local government, even though you are not using the same property. And lastly, taxes are imposed on taxpayers' final product and the storage of raw materials used in the production of the final product. So there is tax imposed on the final product, and there's also tax imposed on the raw materials used. So there's no double taxation in that case. Another double taxation is indirect double taxation. Now the difference between direct and indirect double taxation is that it's imposed by a different state, no? But the same property, the same occupation, but different state. So in this kind of direct, in this kind of double taxation, this is direct. This is double taxation in its broad sense. So it extends in all cases in which burden of 2 or more pecuniary impositions. This is usually allowed as long as there is no violation of the equal protection and uniformity clauses of the Constitution. So if you remember the equal protection and uniformity clause. So indirect double taxation may be counterbalanced through the application of tax exemptions, reciprocity clause or tax treaty, tax credit, and allowance for deductions such as vanishing deduction in the state tax return. So an example of indirect double taxation is what happened to Manny Pacquiao when he won the fight, or winning or losing, he still gets prize money for playing, for playing in the boxing. So if he gets this money from where he plays, like if he plays in the US government would take tax on his prize money. And then when he comes home here in the Philippines, the Philippine government would also tax his prize money. So what kind of double taxation is that? That's an example of indirect double taxation. In this case, the taxes or tax liability of Manny Pacquiao here in the Philippines can be counterbalanced by either tax credit or reciprocity clause. So I think one would apply would be tax credit. So meaning the taxes that he has paid in the US can be used to lessen or reduce his tax liability here in the Philippines. For example, if he has paid $3 million in the US as his, it's too big, no? For example, he has paid $1 million for his taxes in the US. So that $1 million can be used to reduce his tax liability here in the Philippines. So if in case he has like tax liability in the Philippines for 100 million pesos, then reduced by the tax he paid in the US, which is $1 million, equivalent to 50 million pesos. So his tax liability here in the Philippines would only be 50 million pesos. But the findings of the BIR in the Manny Pacquiao case, his total tax liability is more than 300 million. Yeah? Okay. In tax exemptions and reciprocity clauses, this happens whereby an OCW works in a foreign country, So if you work in the USA as a contractual worker, you would be subjected to tax in the US. But there is a tax exemption here in the Philippines that OCWs or OFWs are exempted from paying tax. So there is counterbalance. Okay. Reciprocity clause could happen when there is an agreement between two nations. Like if the two nations would agree that they would not tax their subjects or their citizens, then the double taxation would be counterbalanced. Say, for example, in the US, if they would agree with the Philippines that Filipinos who are working in the US will not be subjected to taxation, provided that the Philippine government would not tax also Americans who are working here in the Philippines. So there is reciprocity. So there is an agreement between two nations that they would not tax their citizens. So in case of vanishing deduction in estate tax, this happens when there are two deaths, no, within the family, and it happens within 5 years. So this, okay, when a father died, let's say for example, father died and then his properties go to his son, then so his son paid estate tax for inheriting all his property, all his father's property. And within 2 years' time, this son also died. So all the properties of the son who was inherited by the father, by the son from his father, would pass to the son's heirs. And the heirs of the son would again pay estate tax. So there's double payment of estate tax within a period of 5 years. So that then vanishing deduction can be allowed. So how do taxpayer escape from taxation? Now we have tax evasion. This first case is unlawful. So here the taxpayer uses unlawful means to evade or lessen the payment of tax. So this is prohibited since this is subject to civil and criminal penalties. Example of this would be the non-inclusion of sales or making of false expenses. So if you sold your property and you do not include that in your income statement, so that is tax evasion. And then we got another type of escaping from taxation is tax avoidance, also known as tax minimization. So tax avoidance is actually reducing or totally escaping payment of tax through legal means. And there are three ways, which is tax option, shifting, and transformation. So the first one, tax option, is paying lower tax in the same transaction. Example would be selling stocks. If you sell stocks directly to the buyer, the tax is 5% or 5 to 10%. But if you sell stock through the stock market, the tax would only be 1/2 of 1% based on selling price. So way too low compared to 5 to 10. Then we have shifting. Shifting is the transfer of tax to another taxpayer. Example of this is the value added tax. So instead of the seller who's paying to pay the value added tax, he can pass it to the buyer. Okay. And then we have transformation, which happens when producer absorbs the payment of tax to reduce prices and to maintain market share. So the producer does not pass the tax to his consumers. No, So the producer absorbs the payment of tax. But he recovers this additional tax expense by improving the process of production. So the tax therefore is transformed into a gain through the medium of production. We're still in doctrines in taxation. There is tax exemption. This denotes grant of immunity, which is expressed or implied to a particular person or persons or a corporation of a particular class from a tax upon property or excise, which persons are and corporations generally within the same taxing district are obliged to pay. Now, generally granted on the basis of reciprocity, public policy, or contracts. The tax exemption as well as tax deductions, tax amnesty, and tax condonations are based on the following principles. They are not assumed, so it must be expressly or impliedly stated. When granted, they are strictly construed against the taxpayer. They are highly disfavored and may almost be said to be directly contrary to the intent of tax laws. Hence, one who claims tax exemptions must be able to justify his claim. So tax exemption is a privilege, therefore it is personal to the grantee. So, and in any way cannot be transferred or assigned to another without the state's consent. So classifications of tax exemptions are expressed, implied, and contractual exemption. So expressed, this is provided in the Constitution. So who are exempted in the Constitution to pay tax? Okay, religious, educational, we have scientific institutions and charitable institutions are exempted from payment of real property tax. While in laws, there are many exemptions granted in laws, no? Like OCW or OFWs, minimum wage earners, and senior citizens, PWDs, they are exempted from payment of VAT. And then we have treaties. Again, this is agreement between nations and franchises. So in implied exemption, this is either intentional or accidental. This occurs when tax is imposed on a certain class of persons, properties, or transactions without mentioning other classes. So incidentally exempting the other class, not mentioned in the law. So in number 3, the contractual exemption, these are this occurs when there's a contract entered into by the government and other citizens of the Philippines or other persons. No? Example would be like bonds. If the government would issue treasury bonds and it exempts it from payment of taxes, the interest, then that is contractual exemption. We're still in doctrines and taxation. There's equitable recoupment. This is tax claim for refund prevented by prescription. So prescription is expiration. This may be allowed to be used as payment for unsettled tax liabilities if both taxes arise from the same transaction. So here there is overpayment made and underpayment of tax due, but the overpayment was already expired because you cannot claim for refund, a tax refund for more than 3 years. So if then it already expired, you cannot claim any form for tax refund, but then the government issued or found out that you are still liable to pay for this same transaction, so you would apply equitable recoupment. So this doctrine does not apply if the taxes are unrelated. So taxes cannot be set off. It cannot be compensated. So it cannot be pakang in our Visayan term. No? So there is no set off. But there is exception. The reason why there's no set off because the government and the taxpayers, they're not mutual debtors or creditors to each other. Okay. But there are exceptions. One, when both claims against each other have already become due, demandable, and fully liquidated. And number two, when there is an actual compromise between the taxpayer and the tax officer. So a compromise is a contract between the between the parties that they would settle the tax claims. And how? By setting off or by compensation. So another word for set off is compensation. So compensation for working like salaries is different. No? So this is discussed in Law 1, compensation, which is this is one of the modes of extinguishing obligation. Then there is taxpayer suit is affected through court proceeding because you have to file it in court. So the object is to stop the government from committing an illegal disbursement of public funds derived from taxation. So if there's an expense that's going to be made by the government and you think it is a direct and illegal disbursement, then you file taxpayer suit. Then we have compromise. So this is generally allowed and enforceable when the subject matter thereof is not prohibited from being compromised and the person entering such compromise is authorized to do so. So the compromise can be entered in the case of taxation would be the tax officer or the commissioner of internal revenue. So we go to taxes. So taxes is different from taxation. So taxes are forced burdens. So these are the charges, the exactions, the impositions or contributions assessed in accordance with the reasonable rule of apportionment by the government or by the state. To whom? Of course, upon the person, the property, or the rights exercised. So there are three subjects here: the person, the property, or his rights exercised, where within the jurisdiction of the state. And the reason is to provide revenues for the support of the government, the administration of law, or the payment of public expenses. So there are three purposes why there is tax or why there are taxes. No? Provide revenue to support the government, to administer the law, and to pay public expenses. So taxes are obligations created by law, and only the government can impose it. So it is a person's civil obligation on the other hand, and without paying taxes, it will give rise to criminal obligation. So pwede ka mapriso. Taxes are generally personal to the taxpayer, meaning it cannot be transmitted to another person. So the government cannot therefore enforce a tax liability of a corporation against its stockholders. So when a corporation is liable to pay for taxes, it cannot make the stockholders of the same corporation liable for the same tax. Gets well about stockholder, only the corporation. Why? Because taxes are not transmissible, meaning it is personal to the taxpayer. So here are the characteristics based on the definition. It is an enforced contribution. So pugsun nyo ka pag hatag, no? Number 2, imposed by the legislative body. So only the legislate or Congress, House of Representatives and the House of Senate can impose it. Proportionate in character, meaning there is taxes based on the ability to pay. So those who cannot pay taxes are not are exempted from paying taxes. So those with more income pays more taxes. This is the equitability of taxation. Number 4, payable in the form of money. So you cannot pay your taxes by way of kindness. You cannot say, hey, I am a lawyer. I can serve as a lawyer for the government for 2 months in order to pay my taxes. So that's not allowed. Or you can pay your taxes by way of a property. Let's say you have a Carabao. This Carabao is worth 50,000 pesos or 100,000 pesos. I can pay my taxes by delivering the Carabao to the BIR office. No, this is not allowed. And then number 5, imposed for the purpose of raising revenue. And then it is used only for public purposes. The taxes it's only used for public purposes. Enforced on some persons, properties, or rights. Commonly required to be paid at regular intervals. So monthly, quarterly, and annually. Imposed by the sovereign state within its jurisdiction. So the government of the Philippines can impose taxes for the Filipinos and other nationals within the Philippines who are earning, who are doing business, or who are employed within the Philippines. So there are different classifications of taxes. And the first classification is according to purpose. So there are 3 kinds of this: fiscal or revenue tax, regulatory tax, compensatory tax. So the purpose in fiscal or revenue tax, of course, primarily for raising revenue for support of government programs and services. Example is income tax, VAT, and transfer tax. And we have regulatory tax. This is otherwise known as special or sumptuary, imposed primarily for the regulation of useful or non-useful occupation or enterprises, and secondary only for the raising of public funds. So example, custom duties, protective tariff on imports. Okay. Then we have compensatory tax. This is imposed for the equitable distribution of wealth and income in the society. Then according to subject matter, there are 3. Could be personal, property, or excise. No? Personal tax is imposed in fixed sum upon resident, like the cedula or community tax receipt or community tax. Then we have property tax, which is imposed on properties. Of course, the real estate tax is an example. Then it's excise tax, which is imposed on the exercise of privileges. Then another classification is according to determination of amount, could be specific or ad valorem. So specific taxes are those imposed on specific sum by head or number or by some standard of weight or measurement. So example would be documentary stamp taxes and franchise tax. So example, if you are going to import jewelry, so this is jewelry is classified as a non-essential because it is for only the rich can afford, no? So because it is based on the standard weight or the carat of the gold or the diamond, then the tax imposed on gold are specific taxes. If you import, on the other hand, um, liquor or spirit like Johnny Walker. These are spirits, no? Imported products from England or Scotland. So the tax to be imposed here is ad valorem. Okay. So ad valorem taxes are those duties based on the value of an article, and actual valuations to be affected by an authorized appraiser. So another classification of taxes is according to who bears the burden. So it's direct tax if it is levied upon the very person bound to pay such as the individual income tax. So that's direct. There is also indirect tax if it is levied upon goods before they reach the consumers and are paid by those upon whom they ultimately fall. Not as taxes, but as part of the purchase price. So import dues is an example, percentage tax, constructor's tax, and value-added tax is an indirect tax. Still in classification of taxes, there is according to scope or authority collecting the tax. It's national tax if it is levied upon the national government. So an example would be estate and other taxes, income tax, value-added tax, excise tax, custom duties, and documentary stamp tax or DST. Now we have local tax, which is imposed by the local government units, which is the city, the provincial, and the municipalities. So example would be community tax, municipal licenses taxes, professional tax. If you are a CPA, you will be required to pay professional tax. In the city or in the province, you are exercising your profession. And then there is real property tax for owning a property. Then according to system of taxation, this is the classification of the different types of the taxation system. We have proportional system. If the taxes increases or decreases in relation to the tax bracket. So there is tax bracket. In progressive or graduated system, the tax increases as the income of the taxpayer goes higher or also increases. No? So if the taxpayer's income increases, his tax liability or the tax rate also increases. So that is progressive or graduated system. Then we have regressive system, which is not exercised here in the Philippines. The tax decreases as the income of the taxpayer increases. So this should be one word here. Still in classification of taxes, we have according to rate or graduation, proportional or flat rate. So this is based on fixed percentage like real estate or VAT or estate tax and owner's tax. Estate tax and owner's tax, it's already fixed now. So it's only 6% of the value of the property. Then we have progressive or graduated rate, where the rate of taxes gradually rises or increases as the tax base or the income of the taxpayer also increases. Regressive rate, the tax decreases as the tax base or the bracket increases. So baliktad din siya. The income of the taxpayer increase, but the tax rate goes down. We don't have it here. Then we have digressive rate. The fixed rate is imposed on a certain amount, but diminishes gradually and sums below it. Here, the tax rate is arbitrary because the increase in tax rate is not proportionate to the increase of tax base. So we don't have digressive rate also. Then there is a mixed tax system. This is tax system that uses a combination of the different tax rates. So here in the Philippines, we have proportional or flat rate, and we have progressive or graduated rate. So as using the two, therefore we have mixed tax system. So other charges, fees imposed by the state or private persons. No? We have penalties, of course, sanction or punishment for violating the law or contracts. Then revenue, that is the term used for all funds, income derived by the government, whether from tax or other sources. Could be taxes, could be donations from other governments or private individuals. Could be commercial revenues like tolls, postage, earnings, penalties, and forfeitures. No? So tools in Manila, it's common. They have when you're a commute when you are a operating a vehicle and you have to pass inlex or SLEX. These are highways, and you have to pay tolls. The third bridge here in still under construction here in Cebu shall be uh, requiring vehicles operators of vehicles when they pass the bridge, they are required to pay tolls. Okay, debt is an obligation to pay or render service. When you have toll is a compensation for the use of somebody else's property determined by the cost of the improvement. It's actually toll fee. Then we have license fee is a contribution enforced by the government primarily to restrain and regulate business or occupation. So if you are going to operate the business, you have to get a license fee. For certain professions, no, you have to get license fee. But in case of lawyers, our profession is not a business. It is for service. So we are exempted from paying license fee. Then there is custom duties. This is imposed on imported goods brought into the country to protect local industry. Then taxes are broader than custom duties, since all duties are taxes, but some taxes are not custom duties. So taxes are broader. Then subsidy, number 7, is a monetary aid directly granted or given by the government to an individual or private enterprise deemed beneficial to the public. So in the sugar industry, it's given a subsidy before by the government because the sugar industry was collapsing, and it's one of our main exporter or main products we export to other countries. Then we have tariff, number 8. This is a schedule or list of rates, duties, or taxes imposed on imported goods. And margin fee, which is the last charge. This is a tax on foreign exchange designed to curb the excessive demands upon our international reserves. So if you would purchase a dollar from a bank, you would be subjected to margin fee. Then lastly, we have the special assessment. It is an amount collected by the government for the purpose of reimbursing itself for certain extended benefits regarding construction of public works. So if there's a public work, like the SRP, for example, and you have a property there, used to be a farmland, nakayuta there, dapit sa SRP, used to be farmland, but now it has augmented, or the price of your land has appreciated because it's now commercial. So you will be charged, or there will be an imposition on your land, and it's called special assessment. So we distinguish tax from debt. The basis, tax is based on law, debt is based on contract or judgment. On the fact of non-payment for tax, if the tax will not pay his taxes, then he will be imprisoned except for community tax. No? Poll tax is community tax. While debt, if you do not pay your debt, you will not be imprisoned. Then as to mode of payment, tax is generally payable in money, but in debt you can pay property or services. Then assignability, meaning transferability. Assign is synonymous to transfer. This is the fourth distinction. So tax, as discussed, is not transferable or not assignable, but debt, utang, can be assigned. You know? Pwede mo i-transfer yung utang. If you have a debt to another person, obligation, you can transfer it by way of changing the person of the debtor. That's discussed in Law 1. So as far as interest is concerned in tax, does not draw interest unless you do not pay on time or you are delinquent. No? But in debt, it draws interest if it is agreed or stipulated or there is delay. Then as to authority, tax is imposed only by the state or the public authority, but debt can be imposed by private individuals. As far as prescription or expiration, so prescription in tax are provided under the tax code, while in debt, it is provided under the civil code. This time around, we will distinguish tax from toll. So as far as tax, it is the unenforced proportional contribution from persons and property. But toll is a sum of money for the use of something. Like in third bridge, if you would cross the bridge, you will be required to pay toll fee. See, consideration which is paid for the use of property which is of a public nature. Road, bridge are examples. Now, as a basis, tax is based on demand of sovereignty, while toll is a demand of proprietorship. Amount, there is no limit in tax, but in toll fee or in toll, the amount depends upon the cost of construction. Let's say the cost of construction of constructing the third bridge is 300 million pesos, or let's say 1 billion pesos. So when the government collects the money for the operators of vehicles crossing the bridge, and they have already reached the amount of 1 billion pesos, so toll fee will no longer be required upon reaching that amount. Yeah? Then we have authority. Tax is imposed only by the government, but in toll, it is imposed by both government or private individuals. Now, there is also a distinction between tax from license fee. As the purpose, tax is for revenue, but license is for regulatory purpose. For basis, the power of taxation, tax is based on the power of taxation, while license fee is based on the inherent power of the police, power of the state. As to amount, tax is unlimited, while license fee is limited to the cost of the license and the expenses of police surveillance and regulation. As to time of payment, tax is normally paid after the start of the business, while license fee you are required to pay it before the commencement of the business. Effect of non-payment, so failure to pay tax does not make the business illegal, but failure to pay license fee will make your business illegal. As to surrender, taxes being the lifeblood of the state cannot be surrendered except for lawful consideration, but in license fee may be with or without consideration. So meaning the government cannot surrender taxes. It must it must enforce taxes. But in license fee, the state may give license even without consideration, without payment. Now there is also differentiation between tax from special assessment. So tax is enforced on proportional contribution from persons and property, while assessment is uh, only enforced from the owners of the lands, especially or particularly benefited by public improvements. So in my example, those only owners of properties who benefited from the SRP, SRP development, or the South Road properties. The basis of tax is based on necessity, while the basis of special assessment is based wholly on benefits. The subject of tax are the persons, property, or the rights or acts, while special land subject is the land. Then the scope of tax has general application, but in special assessment, it is exceptional both as to the time and place. For the persons liable in tax, it is personal liability in the case of taxpayer, while special assessment, it is not a personal liability, so his liability is limited to the land involved. Now we have tax versus penalty. This is penalty is imposed for violation of tax laws may give rise to imposition of penalty. Okay. But tax are enforced proportional contributions from persons and property, while penalty is imposed for violation. It is a sanction. So the purpose of tax is intended to raise revenue, but the purpose of penalty is designed to regulate the conduct of the person. But the authority in imposing the tax only the government, but penalty can be imposed both by government or private individuals. Okay, we go to tax laws. Tax laws is that body of laws which codifies all national tax laws, including incomes, estate, gift, or donation, excise, stamp, and other taxes. Now, our law comprises of the Republic Act 10963. This is known as the Tax Reform, Acceleration, and Inclusion Law, or the TRAIN Law, which took effect on January 1, 2018. Amended majority of the provisions of Republic Act 8424, or the National Internal Revenue Code, or NIRC of 1997. It also includes Republic Act 9337, which is the VAT Reform Law, and other tax ordinances issued by the LGUs. So these are the tax laws. So what are the nature of tax laws? Tax laws are civil in nature and not political. Hence, even during the period of enemy occupation, such as during the occupation of Japanese here in the Philippines in World War II, tax laws are continually enforced, as they are deemed the laws of the occupied territory and not those of the occupying power. Number two, tax laws are not penal, meaning penal is criminal, no? Penal laws. Hence, the rule on the retroactive effect of penal laws find no application in tax cases. So in penal laws, in criminal law, if the law is beneficial to the accused, it can be applied retroactively. You know? For example, there is a law passed today. All persons who are illegally possessing firearms will not be subjected to imprisonment. So dili na daw mapreso ang magdaladalag pusil, illegal possession of firearms. So this is beneficial to those accused. So it would retract. So those who were found out to have criminally liable for illegal possession of firearms shall no longer be imprisoned, because penal laws can be applied retroactively if it benefits the accused. Another nature of tax laws, this is the third one, tax laws not being penal, the rule in the Constitution against the passage of ex post facto laws cannot be invoked. So constitutional prohibition against passage of ex post facto legislations, according to the Supreme Court, only applies to criminal or penal matters, and not laws which concern civil matters or proceedings generally, or which affect or regulate civil or private rights. Ex post facto law is a law which makes your act punishable, even though when the time you commit it, it's not punishable. So example, ex post facto law, when the law will enact a bill stating that those persons who are driving a car which is colored white can be imprisoned for 2 months. So that's an ex post facto law. And then we will discuss the different sources of taxation.